Academic journals have been the long-standing method for scientists to communicate new knowledge and ideas to their peers. Published journal articles are the key to building the reputation and career of researchers, the ranking of research institutes and universities, and securing research funding. So access to this new knowledge is through a subscription model where scientists or institutions pay to access journals. The public and other organisations can also pay per article, but this amounts to a very limited channel of distribution. And this is because of the well-known paradox of disclosure. People are reluctant to pay for something if the value is unknown. But once they've read an article and can assess its value, they've no need to pay for it. So the model that is most efficient is to either have no payment, the open science model, or a fixed payment per time period. Now, most publishers offer a gold or open access option whereby the author pays an additional fee to the publisher to make the article freely downloadable for the public. But researchers, their employers and research funders feel they are paying 3 times. Once to do the research, once to edit and peer review, and then now to have the paper made open access. On top of this, the digital revolution has changed the cost of publishing. Relative costs have shifted to researching, editing and peer reviewing and away from printing and posting. And researchers, funders and public research organisations have been questioning the publishing business model for some years. Is the public getting value for money as they pay for the research? They pay for the public sector employees, who are usually the scientists, who do the editing and peer reviewing, and then ultimately they have to come across a paywall at the publishing end. Does this final paywall constitute a barrier to the translation of research into the community? And what ultimately is the ideal publication model that we should be striving for? So to discuss these issues, I've got 5 experts who cross the Australian biomedical research spectrum. University Manager, Professor Jim McCluskey, Researcher Dr Claire Fidel, Funder Dr Julie Glover, Company Executive Mr James Nhmrc, and Publisher Dr Glenn Begley. What I want to do is first start off with Jim and ask Jim, what do you see as the main issues with the current academic publishing model, and therefore what do we want to change it?
Well, thank you, Beth. I think fundamentally the academic publishing model fails the pub test. And I don't mean publication test, I mean the pub test. We have a model in which most research around the world is funded by governments, comes from taxpayers. It's then done mostly, but not exclusively, in public institutions and done by universities and other research agencies. And of course there's industry research. And that is conducted by researchers who win grants, which are mostly from the public purse. They then write their results up as papers and submit them to journals who have them peer reviewed by guess who? Other researchers in largely, but not exclusively, public institutions. If it's accepted and published, they either pay for that or buy it back through institutional procurement methodologies, which generally means the library buys it back as a subscription. So that the notion that we're paying multiple times is absolutely true, and we are not the researchers, it's the public, it's the taxpayer who's paying multiple times. And at the end of all of that, the taxpayer does not have unfettered access to the research results, unless they happen to be an academic, or take out a subscription to the journal, or have a way of getting to the journal through a library that does have a subscription to the journal. So we pay for it, we vet it, we actually produce it, and then we buy it back, and then the public don't have access to it. So it just doesn't pass the pub test, and that's been one of the reasons for the outrage. And the second reason for what I consider to be outrage amongst the scientific and scholarly community is that the profits made by some of the larger publishing houses are really borderline obscene. And that is not unique to that sector. I can think of other sectors, I won't name them, where margins on activity are perhaps a little more than what the average person in the pub thinks is reasonable. So you've got outrage about the model, the multiple forms of payment, including when you pay page charges and your library still pays a subscription to the journal. So you've paid for open access and your library is still subscribing. And those rare occasions when you might actually download an article because you're trapped somewhere where you need to do it. And lastly, the public don't, at the end of it all, have access. And you might say, well, who wants access? You know, we've all got friends who've had illness in the family, and they go Googling and they look for hard evidence about the treatment of a condition or the outcome, and they finally hit, many of them, about a fifth of them will hit a paywall, a journal paywall. They can't get what they want, and yet their tax is paid for it. So that I think is the fundamental reason why it's broken.
Fantastic, thank you. So Claire, can you tell me from your perspective, how do the current publishing arrangements hinder the career progression of young researchers, especially those working for agencies that don't have full access to the proprietary journals?
So thanks, Beth. I think that Jim has actually provided a really great overview for the discussion because he's outlined what the issue is. So now, how does that trickle down and affect our ability to be able to do research? And fundamentally what we're trying to do is address really big problems facing our society. And at a big level, what we need to properly answer big problems is a diversity of approaches and a diversity of people coming at that problem from a range of different backgrounds. I guess if you look at it from that big picture, when we're talking about academic literature being stuck behind paywalls, what you're really fundamentally doing is restricting people's ability to be able to use that information as a basis to progress forward. And fundamentally, that is the purpose of an academic journal. It is to provide, it's an avenue of dissemination of information so that it can be built upon and so that knowledge can be progressed. And if journals aren't actually serving that purpose, if people aren't able to access that information, then the journals are fundamentally failing in their primary objective. And I think that that's a really major issue. So, I mean, not only that's sort of looking at it, from what I think is a big picture, and it's something that we need to really address. Are the journals serving us in their purpose? Are we getting what they pay for, what we pay for? I mean, the fact, I have some numbers around the profits that Jim was saying. So, Elsevier reported nearly $1.7 billion annual profit last year, with a 37% profit margin. They're profit margins that Apple are making. Apple makes 38% profit. So these are profit-making entities. And so in terms of bringing it back to your question, on the ground, how does that affect a researcher like myself, in the early career? I think that it affects people in lots of different ways. In developing countries, obviously, where the scientists may work in institutes that don't have the ability or the wealth to be able to access these subscriptions, that's an issue. But this is not just an issue facing developing countries, this is an issue in our own country and in our own backyard. I myself have been in a situation where I was employed without a university appointment, and I did not have access to a university library for the subscription. And I was actually unable to access the research that I needed to form the basis of my own research. In fact, at one stage, I was unable to access my own paper that I had published because it was behind a paywall that I couldn't get access to. I mean, that is fundamentally ridiculous. And this is happening in Melbourne, right down the road. And so, I think that this is an issue that faces us locally. And it's not, some sort of wishy-washy, is this actually affecting people? Yes, it is affecting people. If we can't get access to the information, we can't do our job, we can't progress knowledge. And that's fundamentally what we as scientists need to be able to do.
Thank you. Julie, Coalition S, which is a group of people in the research community, which is supported by the European Commission and the European Research Council, have said that with effect from 2021, all publications that are funded by national, regional, international granting bodies have to be published in some sort of open access forum, and there's a variety of them. What's the Nhmrc's position on this, and what's your policy?
Just to backtrack a little bit about Nhmrc funding. So we make a major investment in health and medical research across to improve human health. So $800 million a year in new grants for research in a diverse range of disciplines. And so we include measures in our schemes which where applicants apply to a range of schemes. Applications are assessed by peers and experts against published criteria. And research quality is a really important part of this assessment, and that includes track record of the researchers. And publications are really, really critical. Peer-reviewed publications are a really critical part of track record assessment. And so we realise that there are really strong drivers in the sector to publish. The publication outputs are really diverse across the sector that we fund. So it's not just journal articles, there are books, there are other monographs, there are other outputs that our researchers produce. In order to really maximise the benefits of research, Nhmrc has an open access policy. So coming back to this policy was developed a few years ago and was updated last year. And the policy is really aligned with Australian Research Council's policy as well. We work with them closely on this. And it has three main elements. The element around publications is that it requires peer-reviewed publications that are outputs of our grants. They need to be made openly accessible within 12 months of publication. The second element is that it requires that patents that are produced from our grants are made available through Source IP, which is a database that is curated through IP Australia. And we also encourage researchers in this policy around making their data accessible. And this is under the FAIR principles, so findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. And so at Nhmrc we've started on a journey as well, which is looking at research quality. And the reason why I mention that is that last year we set up a new expert committee which is aiming to increase the quality of research in Australia, noting that we have high quality research, but we want to, I guess, give more guidance to researchers and institutes across the system from at all stages of the research pipeline about what we mean by quality, and this includes publications. And so I guess another thing I just wanted to mention was around the Chief Scientist. If people have heard the Chief Scientist speak recently, he has a really strong message around quality, not quantity. And he's got a 5+5 rule that he has published on and is talking about, which is really, instead of long lists of research publications going into being part of assessment for track record, it's the top 5 in the last 5 years. So I'd be really interested in people's views on that, because I think that is a culture shift for the sector, and we are trying more and more of that with our schemes to focus that. So I can come just briefly with Plan S. We're really watching this with interest. One of the reasons why I'm speaking here today is that our CEO is over in Europe meeting with has regular meetings with heads of funding agencies, and this will be a topic of conversation as well.
So just to clarify, when you say open access, do you mean the published version of the paper or the pre-published version of the paper?
Yeah, so there's different versions of open access. So ours is within 12 months. So people can put a version on. So
it can be the pre-edited,
pre or post-print on their institutional repositories.
And that would satisfy the Nhmrc rules
within the 12 months.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. James, so who owns Springer Nature journals? And can you tell me, just give me a little bit of a sort of a background to what Springer Nature's been doing to address the sort of issues that we've heard?
So Springer Nature's majority owned by Holtzbrink Group, which is a private family entity business. Springer Nature's been involved in pre-merger, so there was a merger in 2016, and both sides of the business have been at the cutting edge of open access initiatives. And I think we've got a lot to be grateful to Plan S for reinvigorating the debate. But it's actually, it's an issue. Open access has been going on for 20 years now, and so I think it's really great that Plan S has re-energised the discussion, and I'm sure that's partly why we're here tonight. In 2017, Springer Nature was responsible for 30% of all open access publications where articles were published immediately upon open access. And we've really, I think, through the engagement with European funding agencies and institutions primarily, moved from a situation of being responsive to demand in terms of open access policy to now trying to stimulate that demand. And so we are fully committed to the fastest and most effective, and I think therein lies the difficulties, the transition to fully open access publishing. I mean, by definition, to publish something is to make it public, so it's pretty antithetical to be in that activity if you're preventing people from getting access to the research. So we certainly see that we definitely want to work towards a fully open access situation. But the issues around quality have come up, and we need to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use a well-worn phrase. How do we ensure that the trust that people have in the journals that they currently publish in, the rigor of peer review that takes place, how do we make nature work in a fully open access world where the costs are estimated to range between 20,000 to 30,000 euro per article? Will funding agencies be prepared to pay for that, or do we think it's right that work goes in to that highly selective journal? And in those highly selective journals, there's obviously huge amounts of in-house peer review and editorial work that goes into that, as well as the external work. So do we, as a community, do we still see the value in those highly selective quality journals? And if so, how do we ensure that we can continue to fund them through this transition?
So just to clarify, you say you have an open access policy. Is that on a paper-by-paper basis, so when the author or authors pay for that particular paper to be open access, or is it for the whole journal?
So over the last 2 decades, there's been various open access policies and initiatives, and it's not one size fits all. I mean, in the biomedical community, there's great examples of being at the cutting edge of so-called gold open access publishing. So Biomed Central, which is part of the Springer Nature stable, was one of the very first gold open access publishers.
For the whole journal?
So they have a list of journals, and they are, so each article is a gold open, they're gold open access journal, so the whole journal is open access.
Right.
Yeah.
Because
Like
if you're just granting open access paper by paper, the libraries still have to buy the whole journal to get around the complete access of the whole thing.
Indeed. So I think there we're talking about
much.
the hybrid journals, where it's a way of, so the hybrid journals which are indeed controversial, in the sense that there was often referred to as the double dipping, where there may be an article processing charge being paid to make a specific article open access, but maybe other articles in the journal are not open access, and so for those a subscription fee is still paid. And even though the prices in the following year should reflect the amount of open access in the preceding year, there is always that situation that there is a lag. So there is an argument indeed that there is an unfortunate consequence there. But one of the benefits of the hybrid journals is that people could continue to publish in the journals that they trust and value, and it provides a transition to move those journals to an open access model based on the demand of the authors and the community. And so that's something that I think is just recently in the revised Plan S guidelines that they seem to have taken on board to some degree, where there is a specified time period for that transition to take place. So that's, I think that's a fairly welcome development in the Plan S guidelines.
So just to clarify, when a journal goes from being proprietary to fully open access, the authors then pay a fee for every, like plus one, like pay a fee for every article published.
Yes, so in hybrid, but again, there is also the option, you could make an argument for it being a benefit that the author can still publish irrespective of whether or not they are able to find that fee. So again, going back to being in a situation where you're an institution or a country that perhaps isn't able to fund article processing charges, but you're still then able to, you're only asked in a hybrid journal after you've been accepted for publication about whether or not you want to make it open access. So if you're forcing people to publish in open access journals all the time, gold open access journals, it may be that they might be in a situation where they find that difficult and they may not even submit their paper to that journal in the first instance. So there are definitely problems around hybrid journals that make it's a contentious issue, but there are certain benefits around them that you have to think about as well.
Glenn, now you're quite concerned about the quality of articles published in journals, despite the very rigorous and time-consuming editorial refereeing process, even in top journals like Nature and Science. Do you think the open access model will address some of these issues, or?
Well, if I can first challenge a comment, I don't think that the reviewing, the refereeing and the editorial process in the top-tier journals is rigorous at all. I reject that. So They
usually reject me.
They do reject me. Actually, there are some good papers in those journals. Mine, just. But seriously, I think that I'm principally interested in quality. And I'm concerned that our journals across the board don't have a metric for quality, and that is something that needs to be introduced, and whatever we can do to improve the quality within our journals is to be applauded. I think too often we place value on the name of the journal and on the citations without actually often even reading the paper that's published. So if I was to publish a paper saying the Earth is flat, that would be highly cited, and I could list that on my CV as a highly cited paper, but of course that's not what we're going for. We want quality. And if the open access process can help improve quality, then I'm all for it. I think it's very important that we start to introduce some sort of metric for quality and review the papers in the top tier journals based on quality rather than simply the flashy title or the laboratory that it came from or the famous investigator who authored it. And most of the time, that is the metric that we use for judging whether or not we're going to cite the papers in those journals.
And do you think +1 being, the sort of held up good example of an open access journal, has that made the transition to high quality that you would like to see?
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
I think there's data that says that that's not the case.
Right.
So it's a step in the right direction.
Right.
But for example, when one looks at the Arrive guidelines in terms of animal use, +1 fails there, as does Nature. So
Right.
it's improving, but we've still got a long way to go.
Right.
And part of the problem is that we're all playing in the same sandpit. We're all working in the same ecosystem. And so the sorts of incentives that apply to a Nature publication are actually then translated to a +1 publication. So it is not the solution. I think the solution is that scientists should read the papers. I think that's the solution. Because
Very
I
novel
think
suggestion.
it is a novel suggestion, and every time I say it, people laugh.
Yeah.
But I'm being serious.
Yeah, I know.
I think scientists should read the papers before they cite them. But the truth is, we all have many pressures on our time. We all have many We all have lots of things to do, and sometimes we're, I'm sure there are exceptions, lazy. And we take the journal and the laboratory and the famous investigators as a surrogate for quality, and it's frankly not. But we should spend more time reading the papers, and I would also suggest that we should get to the situation where, as scientists, we can only publish, let's say, 2 or 3 papers maximum a year. Now, that would do the publishing houses out of business. That, I think, would be good. And I think if we were publishing 2 or 3 papers a year, we would insist that they were quality papers. There are some scientists who are publishing 3 papers a month. That's staggering to me, because I'm not sure how they can even... I can't read 3 papers a month. It takes me 8 to 10 hours to read a paper. So to write 3 papers a month is remarkable. So I think we need to rethink how we're valuing scientific output within the system generally, not just looking at the journals.
Great, thank you. Now, just before we open it up to Q&A, I'd just like to bring it back to Jim and ask him. So tenure, promotion, recruitment's the tail that wags the dog here, because a lot of people, they're trying to get into Nature and Science and Cell and what have you, the Lancet, because that will lead to their appointment and their tenure and then their promotion and whatever happens after that. If, say, the top 100 or top 50 universities in the world, of which University of Melbourne is one, suddenly said, OK, after a certain date, we will only look at your CV that has been published in these open access journals, what would happen to the business model of the proprietary journals?
I think that's the wrong
if it was
pressure
feasible,
point. I think, you know, for the universities to drive the behaviours of their community as a solution to a global issue of great complexity might be very clumsy, and I'm just not sure it'll work in isolation. I think what the funders have got a very important role here, and we know that Gates and Wellcome, the Nhmrc in the UK, the NIH, the Nhmrc, are all mandating that outputs funded from those sources should be open access within a certain time frame or in a certain way. I think that's a more powerful mechanism. You've got to remember, researchers are not just at the whim of whether they're at their institutional promotion guidelines, they're also at the whim of the whole sector, the funding agencies, the publishing houses themselves, who make judgments based on the perceptions of quality and impact factor and so on. So I'd be anxious that putting the pressure down at that level by itself is not enough. This is a truly disruptive issue. Deeply ingrained in here is self-interest, long-standing traditions, perceptions and some reality. And we should also acknowledge that many publishers do actually provide a service, a degree of rigour that may not meet Glenn standards, but at least there's some rigour in the reproduction quality and the consistency in the peer review process. I'd love to just ask a question of our publishing colleague as to whether any publishing houses have thought about recognising the goodwill of the sector in conducting peer review for nothing, and what happens when an institution is quietly funding an awful lot of individual open access papers but still purchasing a subscription to the journal? Is there a discount? Because I think there's an awful lot of unrecognised labour and expenditure that the publishing houses are conveniently ignoring at the moment.
James?
Well, I think peer review, the peer review process, I think, is already starting to throw up opportunity. You know, there is disruption, to use that phrase, occurring over the last few years and will continue, I think, in the peer review area. And I think that's very interesting. There are lots of things around post-publication peer review, To backtrack a second, though, in terms of your discount for article processing charges, then that sort of leads into the so-called transformative deals that we've been pioneering in Europe. So those are the deals that Plan S have sort of recently confirmed, so long as they are in place by 2024, I think it said, then they are compliant with Plan S. And what they do is we look at the way that we've approached it is to try and take a country, do it country by country, and look at what is going on in terms of the publication activity and what's happening in terms of subscription revenue, and essentially flip the model so that you pay for, so all of a country's publications would then be open access, available immediately upon publication to the world. And at the same time, there is still a reading fee for the bits of the database that are not published by the academics of a given country or currently not open access, but effectively it flips the model. So, and in a controlled way, such that we can arrive at the situation where hopefully that we do reach close as possible open access for all research literature. So that is an approach that we're taking. We have had discussions in Australia a couple of times over the last 8 years, which there's not been enough consent. I think there's a good reasons for it and good for the support for green open access in Australia. But that's something that we're certainly engaged in hugely in Europe. I mean, there's 9 deals at the moment in Europe where that's happened. And what we found is that the uptake of open access in those countries, because bear in mind there are still academics that won't publish open access even if they're allowed to do so for free. But the uptake is being between 70 and 90%, I think, in those different countries. So they've been a very good success. The literature, data and studies to date seem to confirm 2 things, at least, about benefits of open access from an author's point of view or an institution's point of view, that there is a greater readership, greater downloads and readership, and not just within academia. The data seems to suggest that more of the general public read academic work when it's open access. And there is the so-called citation advantage, which the literature does seem to suggest, and I don't know whether this is only a temporary thing, but to date it does seem that papers published open access have a greater increase in citations, and also things like policy mentions as well. The so-called alt metrics, or the article level metrics that move away from the impact factor. There seems to be a positive effect on all of those things.
So James, can I just clarify that flipped model you spoke about? That's when the university pays for all its researchers to have open access publication. Is that right?
Yeah, and we try and do it at the national level. So ideally with sort of the
University of Melbourne
could
pay,
all the
instead of paying a library fee to get the journals, they'd pay a library fee to have all their research output published in a open access way.
Yeah.
Right.
And then there is still obviously parts of the database that are not published open access. So we would then, calculate a reading fee, but the whole would be taken into account.
Okay, great. Questions?
Thank you. I have some concerns over Plan S. And I read an article in Nature this week where an alternative was suggested, and that was that journals or publishers bid or apply for grants to publish. Could you comment on it? It was published in Nature this week.
I thankfully did see that one, although I thought it'd be a bit embarrassing. I was actually going to ask this question to our friend from the Nhmrc, whether Julie had a view on that actually, because I thought that was quite a novel suggestion, and I think I can, and personal opinion, I think we're probably expressing here rather than a company one, but I can see there are some concerns around that approach, but there's certainly an interesting approach, and I wondered what the Nhmrc might think about that. I don't know if you saw the story. Essentially, it's journals bidding directly to funders as to pay rather than individual grants or articles at that level, but actually to pay directly to the journal itself to cover open access costs.
So I guess I haven't had a chance to talk about this with anyone else in the office, but we have very strict guidelines about what our funding can be used for, the medical research endowment account, and I'm not sure that would be within the guidelines.
I mean, on that, you're still really talking about taxpayers footing the bill for publication, whether it's through the researchers themselves, who are academic researchers who are largely funded through government, or the government directly paying that. And, you know, I, from my perspective, I think it's still a little bit cheeky of the publishers charging taxpayers to publish content that is supplied to them by taxpayer-funded researchers. They're kind of, you know, double dipping. They're getting the content and then they're charging for it. And so I guess a question is, there are other ways that a journal can create revenue through advertisements and other you know, ways to do it. Is it a bit cheeky by the publishers to be charging taxpayers when they could be creating revenue in other ways?
Well, I think it's in the, you know, we're in a business, and we're in a society that organises itself predominantly around a market forces, capitalism-led economy, and it's been a business for 50 or 60 years, I suppose, since the explosion in scientific publishing, which has outgrown the previous ways it was handled with learned societies and university presses. Now, if it's an activity that could be better done by not-for-profit, there are plenty of not-for-profits in the publishing space, and some of them do really well, some of them struggle, but if we're going to have innovation in our society, it tends to be oriented typically around the opportunity to make money and reinvest that money into better services and products. So whether or not it's right that there should be publishers that make money in that way, I don't think it's for me to answer that, but I think that's the way it is. We're committed to doing the best job we can and to add value in the best ways that we can, and I think it's up to customers to decide.
The other issue with that model, of course, is that effectively it simply reduces the amount of funding available to researchers for research. Because if you're asking the funders, the same funders that fund the research projects, to now fund the publication costs, then the project income has to fall.
But on the other hand, at the moment, we have to pay for publication out of something. It has to come out of money that otherwise go to research.
No, but it comes from a library vote, which is a more complex vote.
When I pay to publish in a journal, I don't get any money from the library. I have to pay for it. I have to pay for it out of my research funds.
Yeah, but the subscription that currently makes journals available to researchers is funded through, libraries, and so it's not coming from the Nhmrc or the ARC. In this model, it would. There's a difference.
Thanks for the discussion so far. Just in terms of preprints, they're gaining a lot of momentum these days, which is, I don't know, good or bad. Can you comment perhaps on how that might influence the quality of the papers coming out, as well as public access and so on?
So we have a repository like every other university in the country, and our researchers are encouraged to put their pre-peer reviewed Word document, generally, in that repository. And we find that there are an extraordinary number of downloads of those manuscripts, particularly from developing countries. It's shot up as we've recently widened the availability of those through another arrangement. But there are many journals that will insist that once the paper is peer reviewed and ready to be published, that it goes off the repository, taken off for a period of 6 or 12 months before it can be then inserted into the repository as a PDF of the publication quality version. So there's still a window of inaccessibility in that model in many journal arrangements.
Rachel Novak, University of Melbourne. We're talking about physical accessibility and open access, and I wonder if we could also reflect on readability and the actual usability of the peer-reviewed literature, because there's quite compelling evidence that it's becoming less usable and less readable, and that has quite profound impacts in the impact era.
Yes, I think it's a really good point. I know that last year we updated our standards to conform, I think, to European standards. I'll have to double check and get back to you on that, but there was definitely an update in terms of accessibility from a readability point of view last year across our content, but it's one example I can point to, for example, is that we make all of our books available in EPUB format, so the text is all reflowable on any mobile device too, so you can make the font size as big as you want without changing the page. But I think there is always more work to be done in that area for sure. Yeah.
Just as a research communications specialist now, about the responsibility of researchers to be able to speak the language of the people, and the increasing, I guess, demand for scientists to be able to speak or describe their research in ways that people can actually understand. I think that that's going to, as we move hopefully into an era of more open access to research, that is going to become increasingly important, that there's no point making it open if nobody can understand it. And so I would hope that along with this change in attitude about our responsibilities as scientists and in reporting back to the people who largely pay us, that part of it, if we're going to move into an open access, is going to be how do we then communicate effectively through those formats as well.
Word of support for Glenn and a question for Jim.
Thank you.
I certainly agree with you on the importance of reading papers, and I can give you an eminent authority who would support that, namely Sidney Brenner. Many years ago, I went to see him in Cambridge before the age of digitisation. He came out of his office steaming at the ears because he discovered how much his lab was being charged for Xeroxing papers. And he came out and he said, the first thing he said to me was, "I've invented this new technique. It's called Nhmrcing. You hold the paper in front of your face and you read it." So, Jim, I don't know why you're being sort of slightly kind about Elsevier. That is an appalling outfit.
It is.
How many of you know that until 10 years ago, Reed Elsevier was part of the arms trade? Did many people know that?
We live in a society where there are many corporates making profits that we would consider unfathomable and immoral.
Yeah, but I think
From
people
the banking industry to the mining industry,
Sure,
the publication industry. So we have to bear in mind that this is our bed. We've made it.
Yeah, but at least that's something we can try to do something about.
I agree.
I mean, not only was Elsevier making these obscene profits and was part of the arms trade until about 10 years ago, which got me a mildly threatening phone call from their office in the middle of the night, because I'd written to Richard Horton in The Lancet saying, "I think this is disgraceful, I'm going to get rid of my subscription." And he wanted to publish the letter, and I got this call saying, well, not very helpful. They also were responsible for publishing at least 5 or 6 fake journals. Sadly, all with the initial title of the Australian Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery or something. And these were journals which were put up so that industry could publish pseudo-peer-reviewed papers and get some credit for them. They have now been shut down, but it was a disgrace. So personally, I will not publish in an Elsevier journal. I will not review for them. And I get requests 2 or 3 a month probably, and I've got a standard letter which explains precisely why. And I hope that their business model fails, as it certainly deserves to. So my real question was, why is it taking so long for the outrage to appear? We've all been aware of this. We've all been doing all this free work, for which we get no credit.
It's a great question, and I think my view of the trigger was, I think, the Finch review in the UK when David Willetts was the minister. And I think there was just outrage when it was explained to them what the model was. So the initial outrage was, you know, this is immoral, it's not acceptable, and it's public funding, and we're part of the problem because governments have allowed it to happen. But there was then, I think they went off the mark a bit when they said, by insisting on open access, we will unleash innovation. And actually, there hasn't been a lot of evidence of that at all. I think we should be clear what the argument is. It's actually not an acceptable model where public funding is used, you know, to fund the research, to publish the research and then buy it back, and then still in an imperfect market where you're sometimes buying back what you've already bought back through a single article page charges. So it is strange, but you know, these disruptions are happening all over the place, and I think it must be a very difficult time for the publishing industry, and I think people like Springer NPG must be looking at Elsevier and thinking, you know, you're going to kill everything here if you don't relent on some of the ridiculous positions they've adopted. UCLA have pulled out, I think Caltech have pulled out, and a number of other big universities are just now saying, well, we're not going to subscribe. And of course, they sell the subscriptions as bundles. Yeah. So it's like you're buying a subscription to 2,000 journals for, you know, millions of dollars a year.
So, Jim, can you just maybe explain if Caltech and what was it, UCLA,
yep,
have pulled out, they're not subscribing to Elsevier,
yeah,
how do their scientists access the research in those journals?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that, but...
you write to the author, they send it to you within minutes.
Yeah, that's one way of doing it, and that happens to me a bit, and I, you know, sometimes I remember to respond and sometimes I don't. I think they're probably doing a bunch of different workarounds.
Yeah,
is the answer, and I assume the academies of those institutions have signed up and said, yes, we agree with this, and we'll live with the inconvenience.
and so does the system need a publisher or a commercial publisher? I mean, by definition, someone's publishing it, but is there a role now for commercial publishers in the academic community?
If they can show that the value they add and bring to the final product is commensurate with the profit margin, then the answer is yes. Because I think they do add value. You know, I know, for instance, that the Nature journals have people who rewrite big chunks of papers in a style that is more understandable, an issue that was raised a minute ago by Rachel. And that's value, they're adding value. I know that papers that come from countries where English is not the first language get a lot of work done to them, and that's an equity issue that they should be allowed to publish in these English-speaking journals, and the way to do it and maintain a standard is to put some effort into that. So as long as we know what they're doing and that it's being done in a way that is you know, sort of commensurate with the profit margin, but you know, $1.7 billion seems like a lot to me.
Can I just make a comment?
Yeah.
I think we shouldn't put all of the journals in the same category. Yeah. So my boss, my PhD mentor, Don Metcalf, used to like publishing in what he called the tradesmen's journals. And the tradesmen's journals, frankly, are much higher quality. So these are the society journals. They're typically better refereed. They're often better written. They're certainly not as flashy, and they may not promote one's CV or promotion or Nhmrc grant sufficiently, although the Nhmrc is working to address that. But publications in the tradesmen's journals are not the same as papers in the top tier journals, where there is a different emphasis on what needs to be generated. So I think the journals that are published by the societies and so on are often of much higher quality, although not cited as frequently as the flashy top-tier journals. So we should be careful which group we're actually addressing here.
I mean, those trade journals often ran by big body societies, self-aggregating researchers. Like JVC and so forth. Yeah.
Up the back.
Maya Soren, ThoughtWorks Australia. As a researcher that's moved to software and gotten a much better understanding of how much more complex it is and how much harder it is to make decent software that gives you accurate results, let's just say I add an extra layer of scrutiny when I read anything that comes from scientific publishing, especially these days with so much of scientific work actually happening at the compute layer, not at the lab bench. And as a scientific industry, we know how to evaluate experimental value and how to evaluate scientific efficacy. I'm wondering whether the panel has any opinions about how we do that for the value of the computational part of scientific publishing these days.
We offer at the University of Melbourne statistical consulting services and other services that are designed to help researchers with computational data, but you can't solve every issue that's going to arise from having a statistician looking at your paper. I think it's a really tough question.
If I can just comment, I think some of the things that we should be doing are pretty simple, frankly. And I published this, and I acknowledge my cognitive dissonance. I published this in Nature. So the sorts of things that we should be doing, we should be insisting that experiments are performed blinded, that they're repeated, that there are positive and negative controls with appropriate analysis, and so on. So what we should be looking for is actually pretty simple. And when I read a paper, the first thing I do is search for the word blind, for blinding or blinded. And in the top tier journals, 90% of the time, the experiments are not performed blinded. So immediately that tells you that you can devalue that paper because the people are much more likely to see what they want to see if the experiments aren't performed blinded. In terms of the analytics, we need to know more about the algorithm that's being used. People need to be able to access the actual code that was used for the analysis, and we need to insist on that if we're going to cite the papers that have used those sorts of algorithms.
As we rethink the nature of how journals are published, we also rethink how they're peer-reviewed, such as using possibly like a more collaborative process for peer-reviewing an article rather than just blinding it and giving it to someone in the field.
Got a few comments, I guess, there. But there is definitely a lot of change happening in experimentation around peer review, and I think it's certainly one of the areas where, for example, PLOS One, there's a lot of, over the last decade, there's been a lot of sound science journals, mega journals, where it's, so long as the science is deemed to be sound, perhaps not to Glenn's standards, but then there's a fairly quick publication turnaround. The scope of those journals tends to be very broad, thus speeding up the publication times. So you might say that there is less peer review taking place on some of those articles. The former editor of the BMJ, I forget his name now, which is embarrassing, but there's who is very ardent about the post-publication peer review being the way that it should be done. But again, I think that it really depends on the discipline. There are some disciplines where there's a lot of fear from early career researchers that they could be easily identified unless there was a double-blind peer review process going on, depending on which field you're working in. It can be very narrow. So I don't think it should be necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach, which it isn't at the moment. But there's a lot of experimentation and disruption going on in that area, and I think that is set to continue, I think, and grow apace, I think, over the next few years.
I would like to see the editors blinded. I'm happy for the reviewers to be blinded, not with a stick. No, but I think there's an enormous amount of prejudice that enters in when people receive a paper from a top-tier lab or a famous investigator, and it does not receive the same level of diligent review that it should receive if someone's famous. So I'd like to see the editors blinded for the papers that they're actually sending out for review.
Up the back there.
I'm Gwenda Thomas. I'm the University Librarian here at University of Melbourne. Just to come back to the question about, so what happens when the big deal is cancelled? There is life after that. And if you want to have a look at the University of California website, you go to their Office of Scholarly Communication. They will give you very clear guidelines around how to access Elsevier journals, articles after the big deal is cancelled. There are various ways: interlibrary loan, your libraries can get it from the publisher on demand, you can go direct to the author. There are also ways behind the unpay wall. So have a look at the University of California Office of Scholarly Communication, and you will find excellent FAQs and guidelines around the big deal when it's cancelled. Right. And there is life after the big deal.
Thank you very much.
Can I just mention one thing I forgot to mention before?
Yeah.
Just about the accessibility issue in terms of making articles available. There's an initiative we've run for a few years called Shared It, which basically means if you are a subscriber, you can create a link to a version of the full text of the article, which you can then share. It means that it has to be read on online, so it's not downloadable in PDF format, but it's a way to share. It was initially created for journalists, for science communication purposes, so journalists could post links in articles where they were covering a particular article, and that's now available for anyone who's a subscriber to use that service. So if you want to share an article that way, you can do that already.
And that's post-publication.
That's it's the redacted version of record, but it's in a what's called a read queue environment. So it's an online reading platform rather than download it and read it.
But you
offline.
still have to be work for a subscribing institution to access it.
Yes, but you can share the link with anyone.
Share the link with anyone. Okay.
I was going to ask about open peer review, which James has already touched on a little bit, but I'll ask again anyway in case other people have thoughts. So by open peer review, I mean published peer review alongside the article, whether that's anonymous or not. I wonder what you think about whether this would increase the quality of peer review, whether it would increase the quality of the original research if authors, researchers know that that's coming, and what it would mean for the publishing workflow.
I think one has to be careful if they're publishing their review and it's not anonymous. So especially for early and mid-career researchers, they are rightly concerned that that might jeopardise their future career. It shouldn't be like that, but that is the truth. So I think I think the review should be blinded. We shouldn't know who it is we're actually reviewing. I think there's value publishing the review, but if it's from an early or mid-career researcher, that potentially has a cost to them as a professional. So last year I was presenting a presentation like this at NIH, and there were half a dozen Nobel laureates in the room, and my typical presentation, I show half a dozen papers, de-identified, and why it is you can't believe them. And at the end, the Nobel laureate, one of them was asking questions, so I turned to him and said, will you identify these papers with me and publish them identified, indicating their problems? And he, a Nobel laureate, said, no, I couldn't do that. So I think if there's concern at that level about what naming might mean, then it's almost certainly a problem for people earlier in their career. It shouldn't be like that, but I think that that is the case.
I think there's another issue, and that is that I think endless peer review does not result in endless improvement. And there's probably a sweet spot, I don't know where it is, it might be 2 or 3 reviews, and then it's diminishing returns. And I think many of us in the room will have experienced the complete frustration of dealing with the first set of comments and in good faith, doing new experiments, whatever, resubmitting and then just getting a new set of comments. It's like, well, where does this end? And I personally think that peer review is mainly about improving the quality of the published product. It's not about seeking perfection. It's about getting it as good as you can get it and then moving on.
Back.
Tony Hannon from the Flora Institute and University of Melbourne. So one issue, talking about quality and in some cases perverse incentives as a handling editor and a reviewer, the issue hasn't been discussed is scientific fraud. So the idea of manuscripts which have fraudulent data and how we deal with that. And certainly it seems to have grown. It's been discussed in journals like Nature recently. And it's a big problem because we think about why we do it. You open up a journal in the old sense, and if you can't believe the scientists were trying to find the truth, the whole scientific enterprise collapses. And in biomedical research, scientific fraud displaces resources from real science to fake science. It delays prevention, treatment, and cure, and it kills someone. So scientific fraud in biomedical research kills people. And so I'm wondering, the people on the panel, how do we combat scientific fraud? Because I see that as one of the biggest problems. And in terms of we reject these papers and then they pop up in another journal because there are so many choices of journals. So actually stopping it being published is a challenge. So I don't know if anyone has any ideas around that on the panel.
Again, it's a very big problem, and I think the people it kills the most are DVCRs, actually. Look, we try to start at the education of researchers, I think, and emphasising the paramount importance of integrity and honesty and accuracy. And we now have software made available to supervisors of PhD students to Turnitin software, which will look at a complete thesis, looking for plagiarism and duplication. It's a tool for them to use with the student to make sure that there hasn't been... we don't apply that, however, to published work that goes out for review, and that only deals with one kind of misconduct. It doesn't deal with the fraudulent doctoring of data, which is much harder to pick. Certainly at the other end, when it's identified in a published piece of work, I think you've got to be decisive and as quick as you can. It's amazing how hard that is to do. Procedural fairness and all the rest becomes a big issue for everybody, is making sure that whatever investigation is conducted is carefully done and follows process. But I think it's the prevention, and that it goes right back to our incentives structures and what we reward and recognise. And I think the comment that was it Glenn made, or about quality being far more important than quantity, is so crucial here, because I think a lot of the drivers of this are the need to have fat CVs to get the job or whatever.
Fraud is a real issue. I'm not trying to deny that. But the issue of sloppy science is much greater. The cost in the US for sloppy science is $28 billion a year. That's an enormous cost. Fraud is real, but it's a tiny proportion of that. There's a direct correlation between fraud and impact factor, which makes sense. If you're going to generate something fraudulent, you might as well get it in the top tier journals. So there is a direct correlation between fraud and impact factor. Again, it's much less likely to be seen in the tradesmen's journals, where people are doing their best, good quality work, adjudicated by peer reviewers who understand the system much better, focus on methods rather than the flashy result.
And we just have to... Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to make a comment on that as well. Glenn and I were just sort of talking about this earlier. I liken the flashy journals to, glossy magazines that show unattainable images of photoshopped people, and we as, people walking down the street are thinking to ourselves, that's what I need to look like. And, it's kind of as a scientist, you're looking to these elite kind of, selective journals saying that's the research I should be doing, that's what I should be able to attain. And often these are actually unattainable, and it kind of creates this pressure cooker where everybody's trying to achieve something that's almost unachievable. And so, I think that it comes down to these are representations of bigger issues in the industry where one Nature journal is career making, and that's why I think that you're faced with a really difficult challenge when we talk about quality over quantity, because then how do we define quality if one Nature paper is enough to say, well, here I am and this is why I should get this grant, because then we're sort of propagating this issue.
Can I just pick up on something there? I think that, there's a role that particularly Nature but also science play, and it's part of the original mission statement of Nature, is to further the public understanding of science. So there's the magazine portion of Nature, and there is an awful lot of science communication work that goes on that's all about making sure that the media reports upon proper science properly. And so there is a huge role that those journals play in that, which I don't think should be overlooked if you're someone that cares about public understanding of science and good science communication.
So last question just before the wrap up, so quick one.
Yeah, so I've got a very humble question, which is nothing like as elite as what you've all been talking about. So I'm a nurse, and I started to do completed a master's online a couple of years ago, and I hadn't had done any tertiary education for quite a period of time. So I did my bachelor's and then I didn't. And when I started my master's, which was totally online, I was told, I had to go in and research and whatever. And I went into the databases and I keyed in my key terms, and I could not believe there was just thousands and thousands and thousands of articles that came up. And I thought, well, where do I go now? And this was really challenging for me because it was online. I didn't have a librarian, easily accessible. And so I started to mesh things and all sorts of blasted things. And eventually I reduced it down, and and then I got a grab bag of articles, which I then read. And at the end of it, I eventually got my master's degree. But I can absolutely tell you I never really mastered searching. I never did. And the thing that really hits me is the asymmetry of knowledge that's really being created through this absolute obsession with publishing. I couldn't even understand the titles of a lot of the articles. They're just getting longer and longer and longer so that they can capture every search word possible so that they can be found. And as a nurse, I am told by my code of conduct that I must follow the evidence. And a lot of the evidence is behind a paywall, and I am not anti-publishing. I absolutely do not agree with your comment, your first comment, which was almost hatred of publishers. I think publishers have gone through a hell of a lot of software development and software engineering that has cost a great deal of money, and I think now they're coming out the other end and realising what an absolute cash cow they've opened up with the scalability of their product. And I think we're now in the true disruption phase where it's all going to shake down. And I don't disagree with the fact that there's a great translation of money from the taxpayer across to the private enterprise, but I'm certainly not them and us on this. I think there's a middle ground, and I think you have to work together. So I guess my question is, when are the academics going to stop this obsession with publishing and the business model that you have, which is to publish or perish, because at the one end of this, you're to blame.
Okay, quick comment, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I think on the searching, there are many very fine review journals that can save you a lot of time, and there are current opinions articles. So there are other ways of getting through the dense quagmire of the literature. And IBM, through their Watson Health cognitive computer, their artificial intelligence computer, are trading on this now. And so they through Sloan Kettering and other cancer centres, are using Watson to interrogate, this massive literature on this tumour with that oncogene and this patient demographic, what's the right treatment. And then they present a distilled version of the literature then to a tumour board who makes decisions. So there are responses to the density of stuff. In terms of publish or perish, it is a perennial problem. And as I said earlier, I do think it's a very complex problem. It's not the individual researchers are swept up in the long-standing traditions, role models, expectations of funding agencies, expectations of promotion committees, expectations of their peers, and maybe it'll snap one day. You know, disruption is often thought of as something that just suddenly turns and everyone looks around and it's different. But I suspect it'll be just a bit slower and it'll take quite some time.
Okay, and what I want to do now is just ask, okay, one final very, very quick question.
Hello. It's actually a comment.
Okay.
I know there's a lot of us here also tonight from libraries, and we've referred to subscription and libraries managing those. Yes, we have, and we've managed print collections. But now we can also help with open publishing. So we have many resources you can come and find out about. We help people online. So don't hesitate to contact your librarians before you go to publish and find out what your entitlement is in terms of publishing openly. Because it's at the outset you need to know before you submit your article. So we've got loads of tools. And come and see us.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give the panel just a final word before we finish up. Can you all maybe say a few words about what would be your ideal publishing model, a way forward? So we sort of heard about a lot of the problems. What would you say? Maybe starting with Glenn. So,
what I would like is for scientists to read papers before they cite them. I'd like scientists to do the experiments the way they know they should be done, and I'd like to get to the situation where each scientist can only publish 2 or 3 papers a year.
Fantastic. James?
I don't think we should be dictating the best publishing model to a room full of academics. I would hope that we respond to the demands of the academic communities that we serve. Having said that, we are committed to the fastest and most effective way to reach an open access situation, because we do want everyone to have access to primary research material.
Fantastic. Julie?
So not directly on point, but I guess I would like to shift the culture and the discussion from publications to research impact.
Thank you. Claire?
Complete anarchy. Preprint servers.
Well, that's what we've got now, so we must be very happy.
I mean, there's the rise in the popularity now in the biological sciences. We've taken a little while to get there, but in terms of uploading research into preprint servers like bioRxiv, these are, open to everybody to read, open to everybody to submit, and it basically lets scientists kind of talk to each other and figure out amongst ourselves what is relevant, what is important, and what is quality research. So I think that preprint servers will serve a purpose.
So you're saying raise the status of the preprints, because at the moment I don't know many people who put preprints on their Nhmrc or ARC applications. Would that be right? No one puts their preprints.
What do you mean?
In terms of
as
citing
part of their
application? Citing their best papers and things.
No, yeah.
No, that's right.
They're not allowed to.
Jim?
I think the quality versus quantity issue is part of the issue here. I'm told that there are more scientists alive and working today than there have been in the history of mankind. It probably depends on your definition of a scientist. But so we do have, a paper published every 15 seconds or something of that nature, which is not terribly sustainable in my view. And I like to tell the researchers at the University of Melbourne, that Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies and Haydn wrote 100. Hum me a Haydn symphony. And the professor of music once did. Which was very irritating, and he seemed to have missed the point. They don't publish much anyway, I can tell. But that's fundamentally where the issue, and so we're sort of entrapped in this vicious cycle of tradition and volume, and which dictates all those other things. And if we could just solve the quality versus quantity issue, we might go a long way to solving some of the other issues.
Great, thank you. So can we all thank the panel very much for fantastic